In the modest dining room of a coastal Maine home, Eleanor Sullivan sat quietly as her son-in-law's words cut through the air like a winter gale. What began as a family Sunday dinner turned into a moment of crushing humiliation when Richard looked her directly in the eyes and said those 7 devastating words, "You eat our food, but you never pay." The silence that followed was deafening, and in that moment, the 68-year-old grandmother decided her 5 years of living with her daughters' family had come to an end. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor wasn't your typical live-in grandmother. For half a decade since losing her husband of 42 years, she had poured her heart and soul into her daughter's family. She had sacrificed her retirement savings, sold her beloved beachfront cottage, and dedicated countless hours to raising her grandchildren while her daughter and son-in-law built their careers. All along, she had held on to one precious secret, the valuable collection of rare maritime antiques that represented 3 generations of Sullivan family history and her last connection to her husband, Thomas. The kitchen clock ticked rhythmically as Eleanor stood at the sink, her weathered hands moving methodically through the evening's dishes. Through the window, she could see the Maine coastline, waves crashing against rocky shores in the distance, a view that had once brought her comfort but now seemed to mock her with memories of happier times. The rest of the family had scattered. After dinner, her daughter Melissa retreating to her home office, Richard settling in the living room with the Sunday football game, and the twins, 10-year-old Jack and Emma, upstairs with their homework. 3 weeks had passed since Richard's comment, yet the words continued to echo in Eleanor's mind, each repetition chipping away at her sense of belonging. She'd never intended to become a burden. When Thomas died suddenly of a heart attack 5 years ago, leaving her with mounting medical bills and a mortgage she couldn't manage alone, moving in with Melissa had seemed like the perfect solution for everyone. The arrangement had made sense. Eleanor would help with childcare, cooking, and housekeeping while Melissa and Richard pursued their demanding careers. What had begun as a temporary solution had stretched into years of Eleanor essentially becoming an unpaid nanny, housekeeper, and cook. She had convinced herself it was a fair exchange for room and board, but Richard's cutting remark had shattered that illusion. Eleanor's fingers traced the edge of her wedding band as she dried the last plate. Thomas would have known what to do. He had always been her compass, her voice of reason during life's storms. The faded photograph on the refrigerator caught her eye, Thomas standing proudly beside their little cottage in Bar Harbor, his arm around a younger Eleanor, both of them laughing at some forgotten joke. The image blurred as tears she refused to acknowledge gathered in her eyes. He should have been here for their golden years. They should have been traveling in that vintage Airstream they'd saved for, visiting national parks and sending postcards to the grandchildren. Instead, Eleanor found herself trapped in a beautiful home where she increasingly felt like an unwelcome guest rather than family. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9, startling Eleanor from her memories. Another day closer to what? She wasn't sure anymore. Her life had become a holding pattern of school drop-offs, meal preparations, and invisible domestic labor that apparently wasn't enough to compensate for the food she consumed at the very table she set each evening. Eleanor gathered her determination like a shield, her movements precise despite the weight of exhaustion and hurt pressing down on her shoulders. Order, routine, control, these were the things she could manage. Even when everything else felt like it was slipping away. She made her way upstairs to her bedroom, the converted office that never quite felt like her own space, pausing at the twins' room to check on them. Jack and Emma were sprawled across Emma's bed, reading together from a book of New England folklore that had once belonged to Eleanor as a child. Her heart squeezed painfully in her chest. These precious children were the bright spots in her increasingly dimmed world, and the thought of leaving them behind made her physically ill. But Richard's words had made it clear, she was a financial burden, not a contributing member of the household. "Grandma," Emma called out, spotting Eleanor in the doorway. "Come tell us about the ghost of Pemaquid Point again. Jack doesn't believe it's real." Eleanor stepped into the warmth of their room, momentarily setting aside her troubles. "Well now, I don't know if it's real or not," she said, settling on the edge of the bed, "but my grandmother swore she saw that old lighthouse keeper one foggy night when she was just about your age." As she wove the familiar tale, Eleanor's mind drifted to the small wooden chest hidden beneath her bed. Inside lay the collection that represented her last connection to financial independence, Thomas's carefully curated maritime antiques. The scrimshaw whale tooth from a 19th century whaling ship. The brass captain's compass that had supposedly guided a famous clipper ship around Cape Horn. The hand-drawn nautical maps with their sea monsters and elaborate compass roses. Pieces that maritime museums would pay handsomely to acquire. Thomas had been a marine historian before retirement, and his passion for preserving Maine's seafaring heritage had resulted in a collection worth far more than most people realized. Eleanor had kept this valuation secret even from Melissa, knowing that the collection represented her only remaining safety net in a world that had become increasingly unstable. As she finished the ghost story, Jack's eyes were wide with delighted fear. "Do you think we could go to Pemaquid Point someday, Grandma? To see if the ghost is real?" "I'd like that very much," Eleanor said, though her heart ached with the knowledge that such a trip might never happen if she followed through with the plan slowly forming in her mind. Later that night, after tucking the children in and ensuring the house was quiet, Eleanor sat at the small desk in her room and opened her laptop. The ancient machine whirred protestingly, but it was private, one of the few things she could claim as entirely her own. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard before typing, "Maritime Antique Appraisers Maine." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The search results populated her screen, each one representing a potential escape route from the subtle humiliation that had become her daily reality. Eleanor had never considered herself proud. Thomas had always teased her about her practical, no-nonsense approach to life, but Richard's comment had struck at something fundamental within her. Her dignity, her sense of worth, her belief that the unpaid labor she provided was valuable. The cursor blinked accusingly as Eleanor stared at the screen. Was she really considering this? Selling Thomas's beloved collection and using the money to what? Start over at 68? Find an apartment? Live independently until the money inevitably ran out? A soft knock at her door sent Eleanor scrambling to close the laptop. Melissa entered without waiting for a response, a habit that subtly reinforced Eleanor's lack of privacy in what was ostensibly her own space. "Mom? Do you have a minute?" Melissa looked tired, the lines around her eyes deeper than they should be for a woman of 42. Eleanor felt a familiar pang of guilt. Her daughter worked so hard, carried so much responsibility. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" Melissa sank onto the edge of the bed with a sigh. "The twins' school called today. They need volunteers for the holiday craft fair, and I promised I'd ask if you could help. I know it's last minute, but with the Anderson account deadline and Richard's business trip." Eleanor nodded automatically, the familiar routine of accommodating her daughter's requests requiring no real thought. "I'd be happy to help. When is it?" "Next Saturday from 9 to 4. Melissa's relief was palpable, another small confirmation that Eleanor's time was considered infinitely flexible, available to be parceled out according to the family's needs without consideration for her own plans or desires. Not that she had many these days. Mrs. Abernathy mentioned they'd handle the supplies and setup. "You just need to supervise the children's craft station," Melissa continued, already scrolling through her phone, mentally moving on to the next item on her endless to-do list. "I can do that," Eleanor confirmed, though she felt a twinge of resentment at how quickly her time had been claimed, how her agreement was assumed rather than requested. These feelings were new. Before Richard's comment, she had gladly taken on such tasks, seeing them as her contribution to the family. Now, each request felt like another expectation placed on someone who ate but didn't pay. Melissa looked up from her phone with a distracted smile. "Thanks, Mom. You're a lifesaver, as always." She stood to leave, then paused, seeming to really see her mother for the first time that evening. "Are you okay? You seem, I don't know, quiet lately." The question hung in the air between them, an opportunity for honesty that Eleanor couldn't bring herself to take. How could she explain to her daughter that her husband's casual cruelty had shattered something fundamental in their family dynamic? How could she voice her growing resentment without sounding ungrateful for the roof over her head? "I'm fine," Eleanor said, the lie bitter on her tongue. "Just a bit tired. Winter coming on, you know how it affects these old bones." Melissa's expression softened with concern. "You work too hard, Mom. Maybe you should take some time for yourself. Join that senior center book club you were talking about." The suggestion, meant kindly, only highlighted the disconnect between them. When had Eleanor last mentioned a book club? Months ago, perhaps, before summer vacation had increased her childcare responsibilities. The fact that Melissa thought she had free time to join social activities demonstrated how invisible Eleanor's daily labor had become. "Maybe I will," Eleanor replied, knowing she wouldn't. The senior center required membership fees she couldn't afford without asking for money, something that now felt impossible after Richard's comment. After Melissa left, Eleanor reopened her laptop, determination hardening within her. The maritime collection had been Thomas's pride, but he had always said it was their retirement insurance if needed. Well, she needed it now, not just financially, but emotionally. She needed to reclaim her independence, her sense of self-worth. before it eroded completely under the steady drip of unspoken resentment from her son-in-law. The antique dealer's contact information glowed on her screen like a beacon. Eleanor added the number to her phone, knowing she wouldn't make the call tonight but taking comfort in having taken the first small step toward whatever came next. Morning arrived with the pale gray light particular to Maine in late October, filtering through Eleanor's curtains and gradually pulling her from restless sleep. She had dreamed of Thomas, of their cottage with its weathered shingles and salt-worn porch, of the freedom they had planned for their later years. The dream clung to her consciousness as she rose, making the reality of her current situation even more difficult to bear. The house was already stirring, Melissa's shower running, Richard's heavy footsteps in the hallway, the twins' muffled voices as they argued over bathroom access. Eleanor slipped into her routine automatically, pulling on her worn robe and making her way to the kitchen to start breakfast. This was her domain, the one space where she still felt confident and necessary. By the time the family assembled at the table, Eleanor had prepared a proper breakfast: blueberry pancakes made from the berries she had personally picked and frozen during summer, crisp bacon, freshly squeezed orange juice. She took pride in these small domestic accomplishments, in providing nourishment that came from her hands and heart. Richard entered the kitchen last, his attention fixed on his phone as he slid into his chair without acknowledgement. He was a handsome man in his mid-40s, successful in the commercial real estate development that was transforming Maine's coastal communities. Eleanor had once admired his ambition and drive. Now she saw only the cold calculation behind his eyes, the way he assessed everything, and everyone, in terms of their value and utility. "Pancakes again," he muttered, finally glancing at his plate with thinly veiled disappointment. "I thought we talked about cutting back on carbs and sugar." Eleanor felt her face flush with embarrassment. No such conversation had included her. "I can make you something else," she offered, already rising from her barely touched breakfast. "Don't bother. I'll grab something at the office." Richard took a single bite of pancake before pushing the plate away and returning to his phone. The rejection of her food, her labor, felt deliberate, another small cruelty in the growing collection of slights. Melissa jumped in, her voice artificially bright. "These are delicious, Mom. The kids love your pancakes, don't you?" The twins nodded enthusiastically, their mouths full, oblivious to the tension crackling between the adults. Eleanor sank back into her chair, appetite gone, watching as her carefully prepared meal was either devoured without thought or dismissed without consideration. "Don't forget the Andersons are coming for dinner on Friday," Richard announced, directing his words to Melissa, though the task of preparing for guests would fall entirely to Eleanor. "Martin's considering investing in the Rockport project. We need to impress him." Melissa nodded, already mentally rearranging her schedule. "I'll make sure my presentation is ready. Mom, would you mind handling dinner? Something special but not too fussy." It wasn't really a question. Eleanor had become the family's unpaid social secretary, chef, and housekeeper all rolled into one. "Of course," she agreed, mind already cycling through recipes that might satisfy Richard's desire to impress without triggering his criticism. "I could make my seafood chowder. It won the county fair blue ribbon 3 years running." Richard looked up from his phone, his expression dismissive. "Let's aim for something more sophisticated. The Andersons spend summers in the Hamptons. They're used to a certain level." His gaze swept over Eleanor, taking in her faded robe and simple appearance, making it clear he found her lacking. "I could do Julia Child's beef bourguignon," Eleanor offered, striving to keep her voice neutral despite the hurt blooming in her chest. "Thomas always said it was restaurant quality." At the mention of her late husband, Eleanor saw Richard's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. There had always been an undercurrent of resentment in his reaction to Thomas's memory, as though he were competing with a ghost for his wife's affection and loyalty. "Fine," he conceded with a shrug that suggested he was merely humoring her. "Just make sure it's perfect. The Andersons could be key to securing the financing we need." After the family dispersed, Richard and Melissa to their respective offices. The twins to school with Eleanor's lovingly packed lunches. The house fell into a silence that felt both oppressive and liberating. In these hours alone, Eleanor could move through the space without feeling she was constantly being evaluated and found wanting. She tackled the breakfast dishes methodically, her mind returning to the antique dealer's contact information saved in her phone. Today, she decided. Today she would make the call that might change everything. But first, there were beds to make, laundry to fold, floors to vacuum, and dinner to plan. The invisible work that kept the household functioning smoothly, the labor that Richard so casually dismissed with his cutting remark about her eating without paying. As Eleanor moved through her daily tasks, she found herself cataloging all she contributed to the household. The hours spent helping the twins with homework when their parents were working late. The garden she maintained that provided fresh vegetables all summer and preserved bounty for winter. The mending, cleaning, and organizing that no one noticed. Until it wasn't done. If she were paid even minimum wage for these services, what would her contribution amount to? More than the cost of the food she ate and the small bedroom she occupied, certainly. The calculation strengthened her resolve. She wasn't a burden, she was an unrecognized and uncompensated asset to this family. And if they couldn't see that, if Richard could reduce her to nothing more than a drain on resources, then perhaps it was time she took her skills and what remained of her resources elsewhere. By mid-afternoon, with the house spotless and a beef stew simmering for dinner, Eleanor finally allowed herself to make the call. Her hands trembled slightly as she dialed the number for Penobscot Bay Antiques, the anxiety of her planned rebellion making her voice higher and thinner than usual when a man answered. "Good afternoon, I'm calling about an appraisal for a maritime antique collection," she began, moving to her bedroom and closing the door as though Richard might somehow overhear. Despite being miles away at his office. "Certainly, ma'am. What type of items are you considering selling?" The voice on the other end was professional but warm, with the distinctive Maine accent that had become less common as tourism changed the demographic landscape of coastal communities. "It's my late husband's collection," Eleanor explained, the words catching slightly in her throat. "Primarily 19th century maritime artifacts. Scrimshaw, navigational instruments, maps, ship models. Some pieces date back to the clipper ship era." There was a pause, then a noticeable shift in the man's tone, interest clearly piqued. "That sounds like a significant collection. Would you be able to bring in a few representative pieces for an initial assessment?" Eleanor hesitated. She didn't have a car of her own, having sold her aging Subaru years ago when moving in with Melissa seemed permanent. The dealership was in Brunswick, nearly 30 miles away, too far for public transportation from their suburban Portland neighborhood. "I'm afraid transportation is difficult for me," she admitted, hating the vulnerability in her confession. "Would it be possible for someone to come here? I understand if there's a fee for that service." Another pause. "Actually, we do occasionally make house calls for substantial collections. I'd be happy to come take a look myself. I'm Daniel Marsden, the owner." Relief flooded through Eleanor. "That would be wonderful, Mr. Marsden. Though." She hesitated, awareness of her precarious position suddenly acute. "I need to arrange a time when my family is out. The collection is, well, they don't know I'm considering selling." If Daniel Marsden found this request suspicious, his voice gave no indication. "I understand completely. Privacy is important in these matters. Would next Tuesday work? Say, around 10 in the morning?" Tuesday was perfect. Melissa had meetings all day, Richard would be in Boston on business, and the twins would be at school. Yes, Tuesday at 10 would be excellent. Eleanor provided the address, then added impulsively, "Thank you for your discretion, Mr. Marsden. Please, call me Daniel. And discretion is part of the service, Mrs. Sullivan. Eleanor Sullivan." The formality of introducing herself to a stranger struck Eleanor suddenly. How long had it been since she'd met someone new, had a conversation that wasn't centered around the needs of her daughter's family? Too long. After ending the call, Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, emotions churning. She had taken the first concrete step toward reclaiming her independence, yet guilt shadowed her excitement. Thomas had collected these items over decades, each piece holding stories and memories. Selling them felt like severing another connection to him, to their shared past. But what would Thomas say if he could see her now? Living in a beautiful home where she was made to feel like a charity case, her contributions dismissed, her presence barely tolerated by the man her daughter had married? Eleanor's gaze fell on the wedding photo on her nightstand, she and Thomas. Standing beneath an arch of autumn leaves, young and radiant with hope for their future together. Thomas had always encouraged her independence, had admired her strength and resilience. He would understand that the collection's greatest value now was in the freedom it could provide her. "I miss you," she whispered to the photo, running her finger along the edge of the frame. "I'm trying to be brave, like you always said I was. But I'm scared, Thomas. I'm 68 years old and starting over wasn't part of our plan." The house remained silent, offering no answers. Outside her window, the maple tree that had blazed with autumn color just weeks ago now stood nearly bare, its leaves surrendered to the inevitable change of seasons. Eleanor felt a kinship with that tree, stripped down to essentials, vulnerable to the approaching winter, but still standing. Tuesday would bring Daniel Marsden and evaluation of the collection. After that, decisions would need to be made. Plans formulated. But for now, Eleanor had soup to finish, twins to greet after school, and the endless domestic duties that filled her days with purpose if not appreciation. As she descended the stairs, Eleanor felt something shift inside her, a straightening of her spine, a lifting of her chin. Richard's cutting words had wounded her deeply, but they had also awakened something that had been dormant since Thomas's death. Her sense of self-worth, her right to dignity, her belief that she deserved better than reluctant tolerance in exchange for her labor and love. For the first time in 5 years, Eleanor Sullivan was considering her own needs first. And though the path ahead was uncertain, the simple act of making that choice for herself felt like coming home after a long, cold journey. Later that evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Eleanor found herself studying them with new eyes. Melissa, exhausted from her day but still checking work emails between bites of stew. Richard, his attention divided between his meal and the basketball game visible on the television in the adjacent living room. The twins, bright spots of genuine connection as they chattered about school projects and playground politics. "This stew is really good, Grandma," Emma said, reaching for a second helping. "Is it the same recipe you used to make at the cottage?" The question warmed Eleanor's heart. Emma, more than anyone, seemed to remember and value the life Eleanor had lived before becoming their live-in helper. "Almost the same. I added a bit more rosemary this time. Your grandfather always said rosemary made everything taste like it. Was meant for special occasions." At the mention of Thomas, Richard's expression soured almost imperceptibly, but Eleanor caught it. She had become adept at reading the subtle shifts in her son-in-law's face, at anticipating his displeasure before it manifested in words. Speaking of special occasions, Melissa interjected, "Mom, I meant to ask if you could take the twins shopping for Halloween costumes this weekend? That grant proposal is due Monday, and I'll need to work through the weekend to finish it." Before Eleanor could respond, Jack looked up with excitement. "Can we go to that cool vintage store in Bar Harbor, Grandma? The one where you got all those old sailor things for Grandpa?" Eleanor froze, her spoon halfway to her mouth. The vintage store Jack mentioned was just blocks from Penobscot Bay Antiques, where Daniel Marsden would be appraising Thomas's collection on Tuesday. The coincidence felt significant, as though the universe were aligning to support her nascent plan. "Bar Harbor's a 2-hour drive," Richard said, frowning. "There are perfectly good costume shops right here in Portland. But the Bar Harbor store has better stuff," Emma protested. "Remember last year when Aidan Turner's mom took him there? He had the coolest zombie pirate costume and won first prize at the school parade." Richard's frown deepened. Aidan Turner's family has a summer home in Bar Harbor. They don't need to make special trips for Halloween costumes. The unspoken message was clear: Bar Harbor, with its wealthy summer residents and upscale shops, represented a social sphere Richard aspired to but hadn't yet fully accessed. The Turner family, with their old money and coastal property, embodied everything Richard coveted for his own family. "I don't mind the drive," Eleanor said carefully, seeing an opportunity. "It would be nice to visit Bar Harbor again. I haven't been back since." She trailed off, leaving unspoken the painful truth, since she'd sold her and Thomas's beloved cottage to pay off medical bills after his death. Melissa looked up from her phone, concern crossing her features. "Are you sure, Mom? It might be emotional, going back." Eleanor appreciated her daughter's rare moment of perception. "I'm sure. I think it would be good, actually. To see it again, to show the children some of the places that were special to your father and me." Richard cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Well, if you're going all that way, you might as well make it worthwhile. The Coastal Heritage Museum has been asking me to look at a property adjacent to their facility. I could give you my business credit card for gas and lunch." The offer, meant to appear generous, only highlighted the financial dependency that had become Eleanor's reality. She no longer had her own money for such expenses, not until the antique collection was sold, at least. "Thank you, Richard. That's very kind," Eleanor said, the words like ashes in her mouth. She had once been financially independent, had co-owned a home and managed her own household budget. Now she had to accept her son-in-law's credit card for the privilege of taking her grandchildren to a store 2 hours away. As dinner concluded and Eleanor began clearing dishes, she felt Richard's eyes on her, assessing. Had he noticed the subtle change in her demeanor since his cruel comment? Did he sense the rebellion brewing beneath her compliant exterior? Eleanor met his gaze steadily, refusing to be the first to look away. For a moment, something like uncertainty flickered across Richard's face, a rare crack in his assured facade. Then he turned away, moving to the living room without offering to help with cleanup, the momentary connection broken. Later, after the twins were in bed and Melissa and Richard had retreated to their respective evening activities, Eleanor sat at her small desk and opened a browser window. She typed "apartment rentals Bar Harbor, Maine" into the search bar, her heart racing with the boldness of what she was contemplating. The results populated her screen, mostly vacation rentals at exorbitant prices, but among them, a few modest year-round options. One in particular caught her eye, a small one-bedroom apartment above a bookstore on a quiet side street, just a 10-minute walk from the harbor. The rent was steep but not impossible if the antique collection brought in the sum Eleanor hoped for. She bookmarked the listing, a small act of defiance that felt enormously significant. For the first time since Thomas's death, Eleanor was making plans that didn't revolve around her daughter's family's needs. She was contemplating a future shaped by her own choices, her own desires. The realization was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. At 68, when many of her peers were settling into established routines and familiar surroundings, Eleanor Sullivan was preparing to start over. All because 7 words spoken in casual cruelty had shattered the illusion that she was a valued member of this household rather than a burden to be tolerated. "You eat our food, but you never pay." The words that had wounded her so deeply were now becoming the catalyst for her liberation. Eleanor closed her laptop, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth as she considered the irony. Richard would never know that his thoughtless comment had set in motion the very outcome he might have secretly desired, Eleanor's departure from their home and lives. As she prepared for bed, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in years, unburdened by the need to constantly justify her existence in her daughter's home. Tuesday would bring Daniel Marsden and evaluation of Thomas's collection. Saturday would take her back to Bar Harbor, to the town where she had once been known as Eleanor Sullivan, respected librarian and community member, not just Melissa's mother or the twins' grandmother. And after that? The future stretched before her, uncertain but full of possibility. For the first time in 5 years, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine a life reclaimed, a dignity restored, and independence regained. All because she had finally heard the unspoken truth behind Richard's words and decided she deserved better than reluctant tolerance in exchange for her love and labor. The alarm clock beside Eleanor's bed showed 3:17 a.m., its red digits casting a dim glow across the room. She hadn't been sleeping well since making the call to Daniel Marsden, her mind too full of possibilities and fears to find proper rest. Now she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, mentally cataloging the items in Thomas's collection, trying to estimate their worth. The most valuable piece was undoubtedly the scrimshaw whale tooth, intricately carved with a scene of a whaling ship in full sail, waves crashing against its bow. Thomas had purchased it at an estate sale in Kennebunkport nearly 30 years ago, recognizing its quality and rarity when the seller had not. He'd always said that peace alone could put a grandchild through a semester of college. Then there was the brass captain's sextant, the hand-drawn nautical maps, the ship's bell from a vessel that had sunk off the coast during a notorious 1898 nor'easter. Each item carried not just monetary value but historical significance, connections to Maine's rich maritime heritage that Thomas had cherished and preserved. Would Daniel Marsden recognize their worth? Would he offer a fair price, or would he try to take advantage of an elderly widow clearly in need of funds? Eleanor pushed the worry aside. She had done her research on Penobscot Bay antiques, their reputation was solid, their reviews excellent. And she wasn't entirely without resources. She had been a librarian for 30 years before retirement, knew how to verify information and assess credibility. Still, the prospect of parting with Thomas's beloved collection sent a pang through her heart. These weren't just valuable antiques, they were physical connections to the man she had loved for over 4 decades, tangible reminders of his passion and knowledge. "I'm doing what I have to do, Thomas," she whispered into the darkness. "I hope you understand." The rest of the week passed in a blur of domestic duties and secret preparations. Eleanor researched apartment listings in Bar Harbor with increasing seriousness, calculating potential budgets based on various selling scenarios for the collection. She discreetly gathered her personal documents, birth certificate, social security card, marriage license, and secured them in a small waterproof case at the back of her closet. On Friday evening, the Andersons arrived for the important business dinner, and Eleanor served her beef bourguignon with quiet dignity. The meal was a success. Even Richard acknowledged the quality with a grudging nod, but Eleanor found herself strangely detached from the proceedings. The conversation about property developments and investment opportunities washed over her like distant waves, no longer relevant to the future she was beginning to envision for herself. When Martin Anderson commented on the exceptional meal, asking if Eleanor had professional culinary training, Richard interjected before she could answer, "My mother-in-law is an excellent home cook. One of the benefits of having her live with us, homemade meals without the restaurant prices." The comment was clearly meant as a compliment, but all Eleanor heard was the underlying message. Her skill and labor were valued primarily for the money they saved the household. Once again, she was being reduced to a financial calculation. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, a perfect late October day for a drive up the coast to Bar Harbor. Eleanor packed a small bag with snacks for the twins, a thermos of hot chocolate, and a folder containing printouts of the apartment listings she intended to discreetly view while the children were engrossed in costume shopping. "Ready for our adventure?" she asked as Jack and Emma bounded down the stairs, their excitement palpable. Neither child had visited Bar Harbor since they were too young to remember it properly, and Eleanor had filled their heads with stories of the charming coastal town where she and their grandfather had spent the happiest years of their lives. "Will we see your old house, Grandma?" Emma asked as they settled into Melissa's SUV, which Richard had grudgingly allowed Eleanor to borrow for the day. "It's not our house anymore, sweetheart," Eleanor explained gently, adjusting the rearview mirror, "but yes, we can drive by and see it from the outside. It's a little blue cottage with white trim, right near the water." As they pulled out of the driveway, Eleanor felt a curious mix of emotions: nostalgia for the past she was revisiting, anticipation for the future she was secretly planning, and a sharp awareness that this outing with her grandchildren might be one of their last if her plans came to fruition. The thought sent a pang of grief through her heart, but she pushed it aside. She would find ways to maintain her relationship with Jack and Emma, even if she no longer lived under the same roof. The drive along Route 1 was spectacular, the road winding along the rugged coastline, offering glimpses of the Atlantic's dark blue waters between stands of pine and spruce. Eleanor pointed out landmarks as they traveled: the lighthouse at Rockland, the graceful suspension bridge spanning the Penobscot River at Bucksport, the granite face of Cadillac Mountain rising in the distance as they approached Mount Desert Island. "This is where your grandfather proposed to me," she told the twins as they crossed the causeway onto the island. "Right there on that little beach. He had planned a fancy dinner in town, but the sunset was so beautiful that he couldn't wait. Pulled the car over, walked me down to the shore, and asked me right there with sand in his shoes and the tide coming in." "That's so romantic," Emma sighed, clearly filing away the story for future reference. "Kinda mushy," Jack countered, though Eleanor didn't miss the way he leaned forward to get a better look at the proposal spot. Bar Harbor welcomed them with its particular charm, the small-town New England aesthetic enhanced by the dramatic natural setting and the fading glory of autumn. Many of the shops and restaurants had already closed for the season, the summer tourists long gone, but the year-round establishments were open and uncrowded. Eleanor parked on a side street near the village green, her heart beating faster as she recognized familiar landmarks. The library where she had worked part-time after their move to Bar Harbor. The hardware store where Thomas had spent hours chatting with the owner about restoration techniques for his antiques. The ice cream parlor where they had taken Melissa during her summer visits. "First stop, costumes," she announced, pushing aside the wave of memories threatening to overwhelm her. "Then lunch at the Wharf restaurant if it's still open, and after that, we can explore a bit. Sound good?" The twins nodded enthusiastically, already scanning the quaint storefronts for the vintage clothing store that promised unique Halloween options. Eleanor led them confidently through the familiar streets, retracing paths she had walked thousands of times during her years as a Bar Harbor resident. The costume shopping was a success. Emma found a perfectly distressed sailor's outfit that, with the addition of some theatrical makeup, would transform her into a convincing ghost of a drowned seafarer. Jack, after much deliberation, selected the components for a Maine lobsterman costume, complete with authentic-looking waterproof overalls and a weathered cap. "Grandpa would have loved these," Eleanor said as they exited the shop. Eleanor couldn't help the smile that spread across her face as she watched the twins proudly model their Halloween costumes. Jack strutted around in his authentic lobsterman gear while Emma twirled, making the vintage sailor outfit billow dramatically. "These are perfect," Eleanor said, her voice warm with approval. "Let's get them and then find some lunch. I'm thinking clam chowder at the Wharf restaurant, if they're still open this late in the season." The shop owner, a woman about Eleanor's age with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, rang up their purchases. "The Wharf's open year-round now," she informed them. "New owners took over 3 years back. Fixed the place up nice, but kept the chowder recipe the same, thank goodness." As the woman carefully wrapped the costumes in tissue paper, her eyes lingered on Eleanor. "You look familiar. Have you shopped here before?" "Years ago," Eleanor admitted. "My husband and I lived in Bar Harbor for nearly 20 years. We had the little blue cottage on Schooner Point." Recognition dawned in the woman's eyes. "Sullivan. You're Eleanor Sullivan. Your husband was the maritime collector, Thomas, right? I remember you both. You worked at the library." The connection sent a warm rush through Eleanor's chest. Here, she wasn't just Melissa's mother or the twins' grandmother. She was Eleanor Sullivan, remembered and recognized in her own right. "That's right," she confirmed, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "Thomas passed 5 years ago." These are my grandchildren, Jack and Emma. The shopkeeper introduced herself as Margaret Calloway and insisted on giving them a locals discount on the costumes. Not many year-rounders left from our era, she explained with a wink. We have to stick together. As they left the shop with their purchases, Eleanor felt a curious lightness in her step. The brief interaction had reminded her of something essential. Before she was a widow, before she was a live-in grandmother performing unacknowledged domestic labor, she had been a person with her own identity, connections, and community. Who was that lady, Grandma? Emma asked as they walked toward the harbor, the paper shopping bags swinging between them. Just someone who knew me and your grandfather when we lived here, Eleanor replied. Bar Harbor is a small town, especially in the off-season. People remember each other. The wharf restaurant stood at the end of a long pier extending into the harbor, its weathered shingles and blue trim as familiar to Eleanor as an old friend. Inside, the decor had been updated, but the essential character remained: polished wooden tables, nautical maps framed on the walls, wide windows offering expansive views of the bay. They were seated at a window table, and Eleanor watched the twins' faces light up as they took in the panoramic view of the harbor, working lobster boats bobbing alongside sleek private yachts, all against the backdrop of the forested islands that dotted the bay. Is that where you used to live? Jack asked, pointing toward a distant headland where a cluster of small houses perched on the rocky shore. Close, Eleanor said, a wistful note entering her voice. Our cottage is just around that point, hidden from this angle. We'll drive by after lunch if you'd like. Their server, a young woman with a nose ring and bright red hair, brought menus and took their drink orders. When she returned with sodas for the twins and hot tea for Eleanor, she asked if they were visiting Bar Harbor for the weekend. Just for the day, Eleanor explained. I used to live here, and I wanted to show my grandchildren around. Something in her tone must have conveyed her attachment to the place, because the server, whose name tag identified her as Zoe, smiled warmly. It's a special town. I moved here from Portland 3 years ago and can't imagine living anywhere else now, even with the quiet winters. The winters were my favorite, Eleanor confessed. Thomas and I would walk along the shore during snowstorms, when no one else was crazy enough to be out. The whole world would be white and gray and dark blue, and so quiet you could hear the snow falling on the water. The memory was so vivid that for a moment, Eleanor could almost feel the sting of snowflakes on her cheeks, the solid warmth of Thomas's gloved hand holding hers as they navigated the slippery rocks of the shore path. Zoe's expression was curious and engaged. You should move back if you miss it. There's a cute apartment for rent above Blackwood's Books on Cedar Street. Nothing fancy, but the location's perfect, and Ms. Blackwood is a sweetheart of a landlord. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. That was one of the listings she had bookmarked, the very apartment she'd planned to inquire about discreetly during this visit. What a coincidence, she said carefully, conscious of the twins listening. Perhaps. I'll look into it. They ordered clam chowder and sourdough bread bowls for all three, and while they waited for their food, Eleanor excused herself to use the restroom. Once alone, she pulled out her phone and quickly searched for the Blackwood's Books listing. Again. The apartment was still available, listed at $1,100 per month, steep for a one-bedroom, but the location was indeed ideal, within walking distance of everything in the small town. On impulse, Eleanor copied the contact number and sent a text, interested in the apartment above Blackwood's Books. Possible to view today? In town until 4 p.m. Eleanor Sullivan. She returned to the table just as their food arrived, steaming. Bread bowls filled with creamy chowder studded with tender clams and potatoes. The twins dug in with enthusiasm, declaring it the best soup they'd ever tasted. Much better than the canned stuff Dad buys, Jack said between spoonfuls. Eleanor silently agreed. Richard's idea of cooking was opening packages and cans, combining their contents, and heating the result, a fact that made his dismissal of her culinary contributions all the more galling. As they ate, Eleanor's phone vibrated with an incoming text. Discreetly checking it under the table, she saw a response to her inquiry, apartment available to view at 2 p.m. Meet at bookstore entrance. Kathleen Blackwood. A quick glance at her watch showed it was just past noon. Perfect timing, they could finish lunch, drive by the old cottage, and still make the appointment at Blackwood's Books. What should we do after lunch, Grandma? Emma asked, breaking into Eleanor's thoughts. Can we see the cottage where you and Grandpa lived? Absolutely, Eleanor assured her. And I thought we might explore some of the shops in town. There's a wonderful bookstore I used to visit almost daily. The owner was a dear friend. She didn't mention that this exploration would include a private viewing of a potential new home. That would remain her secret for now, at least until she had more concrete plans in place. After lunch, they drove slowly along the coastal road that led to Schooner Point, Eleanor pointing out landmarks along the way, the hidden cove where she and Thomas had collected sea glass, the ancient pine tree that local legend claimed had been used as a lookout by colonial-era smugglers, the small beach where they had hosted summer bonfires for friends and neighbors. As they rounded the final curve, the blue cottage came into view, its white trim and gray shingled roof exactly as Eleanor remembered. The property had been well maintained by its new owners, the garden beds neat though dormant for the season, the porch swing still hanging in its accustomed place. Eleanor pulled the car to the side of the road, emotion momentarily overwhelming her ability to speak. This had been her home, her sanctuary, her piece of paradise shared with the man she had loved beyond reason. Seeing it again after 5 years brought a complex flood of feelings, nostalgia, grief, a bittersweet happiness that the place still existed even if it was no longer hers. "It's smaller than I thought it would be," Jack observed, peering through the car window. "But really cool. Like something from a storybook." "Size isn't everything," Eleanor said, finding her voice. "It was just right for two people who loved each other and the view of the water. We could see all the way to Cadillac Mountain from our bedroom window." "Did Mom live there too?" Emma asked. "Not permanently. Your mother was already in college when we moved here. But she visited often, especially in the summers. She learned to sail in that bay." Eleanor pointed toward the protected cove visible from their vantage point. "Your grandfather taught her." The twins peppered her with questions about life in the cottage, where they had gardened, how they had weathered storms, whether the ghost stories about Schooner Point were true. Eleanor answered each query, grateful for their interest in this part of her history, this piece of their family story that predated their birth. Eventually, she glanced at her watch and gently redirected their attention. "We should head back to town if we want to explore the shops before starting home. There's a candy store that makes saltwater taffy right in the window. Would you like to see that?" The prospect of artisanal candy was enough to distract even the most curious children from ghost stories, and soon they were back in Bar Harbor's compact downtown. Eleanor parked near the village green, strategically close to Blackwood's books. "There's the candy store," she said, pointing across the green to a shop with colorful displays visible even from a distance. "Why don't you two go watch them making taffy while I check in with an old friend at the bookstore? I'll meet you at the candy shop in 30 minutes. The twins exchanged glances, clearly assessing whether this constituted abandonment or opportunity. Opportunity won out. "Can we get some taffy to take home?" Jack negotiated. "For us and Mom and Dad?" "Of course," Eleanor agreed, handing Emma a $20 bill. "Choose a nice assortment. And stay together, no wandering off." She watched them cross the green, heads bent together in consultation about optimal candy selection strategies, before turning toward Blackwood's books. The storefront was exactly as she remembered, large display windows showcasing carefully arranged books, the door painted a cheerful red with a brass bell that jingled as she entered. The interior was a bibliophile's dream, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves creating cozy nooks and passageways, comfortable chairs tucked into corners for reading, the subtle scent of paper and binding glue perfuming the air. Eleanor breathed deeply, experiencing a powerful sense of homecoming. She had spent countless hours in this shop, discussing literature with Kathleen Blackwood, discovering new authors, sometimes simply enjoying the peaceful atmosphere when the cottage felt too empty. During Thomas's research trips, Eleanor Sullivan, "As I live and breathe." The delighted exclamation came from behind the counter, where a woman in her early 70s with a silver braid and wire-rimmed glasses was sorting through a stack of new arrivals. "I thought you might be a ghost when I got your text." "Kathleen." Eleanor moved forward, accepting the warm embrace her old friend offered. "It's been too long." 5 years and change, Kathleen confirmed, holding Eleanor at arm's length to examine her. "Since Thomas's funeral. You look well, though perhaps a bit thin. Are you eating properly?" The irony of the question, given Richard's cruel comment about Eleanor eating without paying, almost provoked hysterical laughter. Instead, she managed a wry smile. "I eat. Whether I'm nourished is another question entirely." Something in her tone must have communicated volumes, because Kathleen's expression shifted from delight to concern. "That bad, is it? Well, no wonder you're interested in the apartment. Come, let me show you. We can talk more privately upstairs." A discreet door at the back of the shop led to a narrow staircase. Kathleen explained as they climbed, "I converted the second floor into an apartment about 10 years ago. Used to be storage, but with property values what they are in Bar Harbor, it seemed wasteful not to make it livable space." The apartment was simple but charming, one bedroom, a small but functional kitchen, a living area with built-in bookshelves and a bay window overlooking Cedar Street, and a bathroom with an old-fashioned clawfoot tub. The sloped ceilings and Dormer windows gave the space a cozy, almost storybook quality. "It's lovely," Eleanor said, genuinely impressed. "Much nicer than I expected from the listing." Kathleen waved away the compliment. "It's small, but it has character. Now sit down and tell me why Eleanor Sullivan, who moved to Portland to be near her daughter and grandchildren, is suddenly interested in a one-bedroom apartment 2 hours away." Eleanor sank into one of the comfortable armchairs positioned by the bay window, finding herself uncharacteristically eager to unburden herself. Kathleen had been a true friend during her years in Bar Harbor, the kind of friend who spoke hard truths with kindness, who offered support without judgment. "It's a long story," she began. "Those are the only kind worth telling," Kathleen replied, settling into the opposite chair. "And we have," she checked her watch, "approximately 20 minutes before 2 children high on saltwater taffy come looking for their grandmother. So make it the abridged version." Eleanor found herself smiling despite the seriousness of the situation. She had missed Kathleen's no-nonsense approach to life, her ability to cut through pretense to the heart of any matter. "I'm living with my daughter and her family," she explained. "Have been since Thomas died and the medical bills forced me to sell the cottage. It was supposed to be temporary, just until I got back on my feet financially. But 5 years have passed, and I've become," she searched for the right word, "an unpaid domestic servant rather than a family member." Kathleen's expression was sympathetic but not pitying. "The daughter treating you poorly?" "No, Melissa is just oblivious. She works 60-hour weeks, has 2 10-year-old twins, and a husband with ambitions that keep him equally busy. I've become the household manager by default, cooking, cleaning, childcare. I don't mind the work, truly. What I mind is being treated as though my contributions are worthless because they don't come with a paycheck." "Ah," Kathleen said, understanding dawning. "The son-in-law, then?" Eleanor nodded, the hurt of Richard's comment still fresh despite the weeks that had passed. 3 weeks ago, during a family dinner that I had prepared, as I always do, he looked me directly in the eyes and said, 'You eat our food, but you never pay.'" Kathleen's eyes widened, genuine shock crossing her features. "He didn't." "He did. And in that moment, something inside me broke. Or perhaps it was repaired. I realized I couldn't continue living where my value was measured solely by my financial contribution, or lack thereof, rather than by the 100 invisible ways I support their household and family." "So you're planning to move back to Bar Harbor," Kathleen concluded. "But Eleanor, forgive my bluntness, what will you live on? The cost of living here has only increased since you left." This was the delicate part of the conversation, the piece Eleanor had been reluctant to share even with her oldest friend. "I'm selling Thomas's maritime collection. It's the only asset I have left that's truly mine." Kathleen's expression softened with understanding. The collection was never just about the objects for Thomas. It was about the stories they carried, the history they preserved. He would understand your need to use them now to secure your future. The validation brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. "That's what I keep telling myself. But it feels like betraying him somehow, selling pieces he spent decades collecting." "Nonsense," Kathleen said firmly. "Thomas would be horrified to know his beloved wife was being treated as a burden in her own family. He'd be the first to say, sell it all if it meant restoring your independence and dignity." Eleanor brushed away the tears, grateful for her friend's matter-of-fact support. "I have an appraiser coming to the house on Tuesday. Daniel Marsden from Penobscot Bay Antiques." "Dan Marsden is a good man," Kathleen affirmed. "Fair prices, ethical business practices. If anyone will give you proper value for the collection, it's him." She paused, then added gently, "But have you considered what this will mean for your relationship with your grandchildren? They're still young, 10, you said? Moving 2 hours away is the hardest part of this decision," Eleanor admitted. "I adore those children. The thought of not seeing them daily breaks my heart. But I have to believe that a grandmother who visits less frequently but is whole and happy is better than one who is present but diminished by daily indignities." Kathleen nodded slowly, processing this perspective. "And your daughter? Have you discussed any of this with her?" "Not yet. I wanted to have a concrete plan in place first. Melissa tends to manage problems away. If I tell her I'm unhappy, she'll suggest family counseling or schedule a heart-to-heart with Richard that will result in temporary improvements but no fundamental change. I need to do this my way, on my terms." "Well then," Kathleen said, rising from her chair with decisive energy, "let's talk practicalities. The apartment rent is $1,100 monthly, utilities included except for internet. First and last month's rent as deposit. No pets, though I might make an exception for a cat. The mice in the building's old bones are resourceful. The lease would be month to month, given your fluid situation. The businesslike transition was exactly what Eleanor needed, a shift from emotional deliberation to concrete planning. When would it be available? Immediately. The previous tenant left 3 weeks ago, graduate student who was doing research at the marine lab for the summer and fall. Eleanor glanced around the apartment again, trying to envision herself in the space, her books on the shelves, her quilt on the bed, her tea kettle on the stove. It was smaller than her room at Melissa's house, but it would be entirely hers. A place where she made the rules, where her presence wasn't constantly evaluated for its utility, where she could rebuild an identity separate from her roles as mother and grandmother. "I'll take it," she said, the decision crystallizing in that moment. "Assuming the appraisal goes well and the collection sells for what I hope." Kathleen smiled, a mixture of satisfaction and concern in her expression. "I'll hold it for you until the end of November without a deposit. After that, I'd need some kind of commitment." "That's more than fair," Eleanor said, rising to embrace her friend. "Thank you, Kathleen. Not just for the apartment, but for understanding. What are old friends for, if not to help each other start over when necessary?" Kathleen replied, returning the hug with genuine warmth. "Now, let's go rescue Bar Harbor from your sugar-infused grandchildren before they buy out the entire candy store." They descended the stairs to find Jack and Emma already waiting in the bookstore, clutching bags of colorful taffy and vibrating with barely contained energy. "Grandma, we got every flavor," Jack announced, his voice carrying through the quiet shop. "Even weird ones like blueberry basil and maple bacon." "Miss Blackwood, these are my grandchildren, Jack and Emma," Eleanor said, performing the introductions with a mixture of pride and wistfulness. Would these bright, curious children understand her decision to move away? Would they feel abandoned, or would they recognize that she was modeling an important lesson about self-respect and dignity? "Pleased to meet you both," Kathleen said, her tone warming as she addressed the twins. "Your grandmother and I are old friends. She used to help me organize the children's reading program here at the bookstore many years ago." "You did?" Emma looked at Eleanor with newfound interest. "Were you a librarian or something?" "For 30 years, Eleanor confirmed, realizing she rarely spoke to her grandchildren about her professional life before retirement. In their eyes, she had always been simply Grandma, the woman who cooked their meals and helped with their homework. "I worked at the public library here in Bar Harbor, and before that, at a university library in Portland." "Cool," Jack said, his attention already drifting to the display of nautical adventure books near the counter. "Do you have any books about pirates or sea monsters?" Kathleen's eyes lit up at the question. "Do I have books about pirates? Young man, you've come to the right place. Let me show you our maritime adventure section." As Kathleen led Jack toward a bookshelf at the back of the store, Emma tugged at Eleanor's sleeve. "Grandma, who's that man in the picture with you and Grandpa?" She pointed to a framed photograph on the wall behind the counter, a younger Eleanor and Thomas flanking Kathleen at what appeared to be a book signing event. "That's Robert McCloskey," Eleanor explained, studying the photograph with a rush of nostalgia. "He wrote, 'Make Way for Ducklings and Blueberries for Sal,' books I used to read to your mother when she was small. And to you when you were younger. He lived on an island not far from here and occasionally did signings at the bookstore. That picture was taken about 25 years ago." Emma studied the photograph with new appreciation. "You knew a real author? That's so cool. Did you know any other famous people when you lived here?" The question opened a floodgate of memories and stories that Eleanor had seldom shared with her grandchildren. As they wandered through the bookstore, waiting for Jack to select a pirate novel with Kathleen's expert guidance, Eleanor told Emma about the summer when a renowned marine biologist had given a lecture series at the library, about the time a Hollywood location scout had visited Bar Harbor seeking settings for a historical drama, about the local artists and writers who had formed the tight-knit community that had made this small town feel like the center of a vibrant cultural universe. With each story, Eleanor felt herself reconnecting with parts of her identity that had been submerged during her years in Melissa's home, her intellectual curiosity, her love of literature and art, her role as a community builder and knowledge keeper. In Bar Harbor, she had been Eleanor Sullivan, librarian, community volunteer, respected professional. In Portland, she had been reduced to Melissa's mother, or the twins' grandmother, her past accomplishments and interests rendered invisible by the domestic role she had assumed. The realization strengthened her resolve. The apartment above Blackwood's books wasn't just a place to live, it was an opportunity to reclaim the fullness of her identity, to be seen and valued for all that she was, not just for the services she provided to her daughter's family. By the time they left the bookstore, Jack proudly clutching a new novel about a young sailor's adventures with Caribbean pirates, Emma having selected a book about women lighthouse keepers of New England, Eleanor felt more certain than ever about her decision. Bar Harbor wasn't just a place she had once lived, it was a community that remembered her, that still had a place for her. The drive back to Portland was filled with the twins' excited chatter about their day in Bar Harbor, the costumes, the chowder, the taffy, the bookstore. Eleanor listened with a bittersweet mixture of joy and sadness, treasuring these moments, while acutely aware that such carefree times together might soon be less frequent. "Can we come back sometime, Grandma?" Emma asked as they approached the outskirts of Portland, the October darkness falling early around them. "Maybe in the summer when we can swim in the ocean?" "I'd like that very much," Eleanor replied, carefully, non-committal about where she might be living by summer. Bar Harbor is beautiful in all seasons, but summer has its own special magic. As they pulled into the driveway of Melissa's house, Eleanor noticed Richard's car already parked in its usual spot. He had returned from his business trip a day early, it seemed. The observation sent a flutter of anxiety through her chest. Would he question their day trip to Bar Harbor? Would he make some dismissive comment about the unnecessary expense of driving 2 hours for Halloween costumes that could have been purchased locally? The twins bounded from the car, eager to show off their costume purchases and share the salt water taffy with their parents. Eleanor followed more slowly, steeling herself for whatever reception awaited inside. Melissa met them at the door, her expression harried as she tried to manage a work call while greeting her children. "Yes, I have those figures. Hold on just a second," she covered the phone's microphone to whisper, "Dad's in a mood. The Boston meeting didn't go well. Maybe give him some space." Eleanor nodded her understanding, helping the twins shed their coats and corralling their shopping bags. From the living room came the sounds of a football game on television, punctuated occasionally by Richard's frustrated sighs or muttered comments about the referee's poor judgment. After hanging up her call, Melissa examined the Halloween costumes with appropriate enthusiasm, exclaiming over Emma's ghost sailor outfit and Jack's authentic lobsterman gear. "These are perfect. Much more creative than anything we'd have found at the mall." "Was Bar Harbor wonderful?" "I haven't been there in ages." "It was amazing, Mom." Emma launched into a detailed account of their day, with Jack interjecting whenever he felt his sister had omitted an important detail. Eleanor used their distraction to slip into the kitchen, hoping to prepare dinner without having to interact with Richard until his mood had improved. No such luck. As she was inventorying the refrigerator contents, planning a simple pasta dish that could be prepared quickly, Richard appeared in the doorway. "I hear you took the kids all the way to Bar Harbor for Halloween costumes," he said, his tone carefully neutral but with an underlying current of disapproval. "That's quite a drive for a shopping trip." Eleanor continued removing ingredients from the refrigerator, refusing to be baited into an apology. "It was a beautiful day for a coastal drive. The children enjoyed seeing where their grandfather and I used to live." Richard leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Did you use the credit card I gave you for gas and lunch?" The question, focused on finances rather than on whether the children had enjoyed their day, was so typically Richard that Eleanor almost laughed. "Yes, as you instructed. I kept the receipt for your records." She moved to the counter, beginning to chop onions and garlic for the pasta sauce, her back deliberately turned to her son-in-law. The small act of resistance felt significant, a refusal to engage with his implied criticism, a silent assertion that her choices didn't require his approval. "The Boston investors are hesitating on the Rockport project," Richard said after a moment of loaded silence. "Worried about the economic forecast for next year. We may need to tighten our belts around here if that deal falls through." Eleanor recognized the statement for what it was, a reminder of her financial dependence, a subtle reinforcement of his position as the family's provider and decision-maker. 3 weeks ago, such a comment would have filled her with anxiety and guilt. Now, with the apartment above Blackwood's books a concrete possibility and Daniel Marsden's appraisal just days away, she felt only a calm determination. "I'm sure you'll figure it out," she said mildly, continuing her meal preparations without missing a beat. "You're very resourceful." Something in her tone, perhaps its lack of the usual deference, caused Richard to look at her more closely. "You seem different since your trip. Bar Harbor bring back too many memories?" The question contained a trace of genuine curiosity beneath the perfunctory concern. Eleanor considered her response carefully, aware that any hint of her plans would likely trigger Richard's controlling instincts. "Good memories," she said simply. "It was nice to visit places that were significant to Thomas and me. To share those stories with the twins." Richard nodded, apparently satisfied with this explanation for her subdued demeanor. "Well, I'm glad you all had a good time. Just remember that with the holidays coming up and the uncertainty with the Rockport project, we need to be thoughtful about unnecessary expenses." The implied criticism hung in the air as he returned to his football game, leaving Eleanor alone in the kitchen with her simmering resentment and newly fortified resolve. Once, she would have internalized his comment, would have felt guilty for wasting money on a trip that had brought such joy to her grandchildren. Now she recognized his words for what they were, another attempt to diminish her, to reduce her to a financial calculation rather than a human being with needs and desires of her own. As she stirred the pasta sauce, Eleanor's thoughts returned to the apartment above Blackwood's Books, its bay window overlooking Cedar Street, its built-in bookshelves waiting to be filled, its promise of dignity and independence. Tuesday couldn't come soon enough. Daniel Marsden's appraisal would determine whether her dream of escape was financially viable or merely a desperate fantasy. Either way, Eleanor Sullivan had taken the first concrete steps toward reclaiming her life. She had seen an alternative to the slow erosion of her spirit in Richard and Melissa's home. She had remembered who she was before grief and financial necessity had reduced her to an unpaid domestic servant. And most importantly, she had made a decision that was hers alone, not influenced by her daughter's needs or her son-in-law's expectations, but driven by her own desire for dignity and respect. As she called the family to dinner, setting plates of pasta around the table with practiced efficiency, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the cautious optimism of someone making the best of difficult circumstances, but the genuine anticipation of positive change, of a future shaped by her own choices rather than by others' convenience. Richard's cruel words, "You eat our food, but you never pay," had wounded her deeply. But like many painful moments in life, they had also served as a catalyst, forcing her to confront truths she had been avoiding and to take action she might otherwise have indefinitely postponed. For that unintended gift, Eleanor reflected as she watched her family gather around the table she had prepared, she might one day even find it in her heart to thank him. Tuesday morning arrived with a clarity that seemed almost symbolic to Eleanor. The October sky stretched an impossible blue above Portland, the kind of autumn day that poets tried to capture in verse, crisp, brilliant, full of possibility. She had risen before dawn, too anxious about Daniel Marsden's impending visit to sleep, and had spent the early hours carefully removing Thomas's maritime collection from its hiding places around her room. Each piece emerged from its protective wrapping like a long-lost friend. The scrimshaw whale tooth with its intricate carving of a whaling ship in full sail. The brass captain's sextant, still gleaming despite its century and a half of existence. The hand-drawn nautical maps with their sea monsters and elaborate compass roses. The ship's bell, its surface etched with the name of the vessel lost in the 1898 nor'easter. A dozen more treasures, each with its own story, its own connection to Maine's rich maritime heritage. Eleanor arranged them on her bed, transforming the plain comforter into a museum-worthy display. Thomas would have appreciated the care she took, the respect she showed for these objects that had been his passion. She could almost hear his voice describing each piece to an imaginary audience, his enthusiasm infectious as he explained the historical significance of a particular navigation tool or the cultural context of a scrimshaw design. "I'm doing what I must," she whispered to his memory, running her fingers lightly over the polished surface of a whalebone letter opener. "I hope you understand." By 9 o'clock, the house was empty except for Eleanor. Melissa had left for an early meeting, dropping the twins at school on her way. Richard was in Boston again, trying to salvage the Rockport project investment. The timing couldn't have been more perfect for Daniel Marsden's discreet visit. Eleanor had spent the previous evening preparing, not just gathering the collection, but also researching current market values for similar items, making notes about provenance and historical context, even practicing what she would say when Marsden made his offer. She was determined to approach this transaction as a businesswoman, not as a desperate widow seeking escape from an untenable living situation. At precisely 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Eleanor smoothed her cardigan, she had chosen her outfit carefully, wanting to project confidence and self-possession, and went to answer it. She had always taught them that love didn't diminish with distance, that family bonds transcended physical separation. Now she would need to embody that lesson, to demonstrate that her love for them remained constant even as she reclaimed the independence necessary for her own well-being. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, Eleanor thought about the journey ahead. At 68, she was preparing to start over, to rebuild a life of her own in a community that had once been home. The prospect was daunting but also deeply exciting, a final adventure she hadn't anticipated but now embraced with growing confidence. Richard's cruel words, "You eat our food, but you never pay," had wounded her deeply. But they had also awakened her from a kind of passive acceptance, challenging her to recognize her own worth and to demand the respect she deserved. In a strange way, she owed him a debt of gratitude for that unintended gift, the catalyst that had propelled her toward reclaiming her dignity, her independence, and ultimately, her sense of self. As sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor's last conscious thought was of the apartment above Blackwood's Books, the bay window overlooking Cedar Street, the built-in bookshelves waiting to be filled with her cherished volumes, the fresh start it represented. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not a retreat, but an advance toward the life she deserved, one where her value wasn't measured by the services she provided but by the simple, profound fact of her existence as a woman of wisdom, experience, and enduring strength. The days between Tuesday and Friday passed in a strange limbo for Eleanor, caught between her current life and the new one awaiting her in Bar Harbor. She continued her usual routines, preparing meals, helping with homework, maintaining the household, while secretly making final preparations for her departure. Wednesday morning, she visited her doctor to refill prescriptions and ensure her medical records could be transferred to a new provider in Bar Harbor. Wednesday afternoon, she discreetly packed more of her belongings, tucking the boxes at the back of her closet where they wouldn't be noticed. Wednesday evening, she prepared Richard's favorite meal, a gesture not of subservience but of closure, a final act of care before her departure. Thursday brought a flurry of quiet activity. A trip to the bank to arrange for her Social Security deposits to be redirected to her new account. A visit to the cell phone store to establish service independent from the family plan Richard had insisted she join, for economy's sake. A stop at the post office to submit a change of address form, effective Saturday. Each small task represented another step toward independence, another thread of her former life gently but firmly severed. By Thursday evening, when she sat with the twins helping them practice their lines for the Halloween presentation at school, Eleanor had transformed from a woman contemplating escape to one with a concrete exit strategy, lacking only the final emotional step of informing her family. That night, after the household had settled into sleep, Eleanor wrote 3 letters. One to Melissa, explaining her decision more fully than their brief conversation had allowed, emphasizing her continuing love and her desire for a relationship based on mutual respect rather than dependency. One to the twins, written in simpler language, reassuring them of her love and promising regular visits, phone calls, and special outings to maintain their close bond. And one to Richard, the most difficult to compose, expressing neither anger nor accusation but a clear-eyed assessment of how his attitude had contributed to her decision to leave. When you said I eat but don't pay, she wrote in the final paragraph, you reduced our relationship to a financial transaction, ignoring the countless ways I have contributed to this household. I deserve to live where my presence is valued, not merely tolerated. I hope in time you will recognize that worth isn't measured solely in dollars, that care and love and guidance have a value beyond economic calculation. She sealed each letter in an envelope, tucking them into the drawer of her nightstand. She would leave them behind on Saturday after the movers had taken her belongings, her final communication before beginning her new life in Bar Harbor. Friday dawned clear and cold, a perfect autumn day for the school's Halloween celebration. Eleanor woke with a strange sense of calm, the anxiety of the past days replaced by quiet certainty. Today she would watch her grandchildren participate in their Halloween parade and presentation. Tonight she would tell her family about tomorrow's departure. And tomorrow, she would begin again at 68, proving that it was never too late to choose dignity, independence, and self-respect. She prepared a special breakfast, pumpkin pancakes shaped like ghosts, a Halloween tradition she had established when the twins were small. As Jack and Emma devoured them with characteristic enthusiasm, Eleanor memorized the moment, their animated chatter, their excitement about the day ahead, the easy affection between them that reminded her of Melissa and her sister at that age. You're the best, Grandma, Jack declared between bites, maple syrup glistening on his chin. Nobody makes pancakes like you. Dad tries, Emma added loyally, but they always come out weird shapes and sometimes they're still gooey in the middle. The simple validation, acknowledgement of her skill at this small domestic task, warmed Eleanor's heart. The twins, at least, had never taken her contributions for granted, had always expressed appreciation for the care she showed through cooking, listening, helping, guiding. I love making them for you, she said, emotion making her voice slightly husky. Some of my happiest memories are of cooking with you both. The twins exchanged glances, perhaps detecting something unusual in her tone. Are you okay, Grandma? Emma asked, her perceptiveness sometimes startling for a 10-year-old. I'm wonderful, Eleanor assured her, and realized with some surprise that it was true. Despite the emotional complexity of her imminent departure, she felt more whole, more herself, than she had in years. Just a bit sentimental this morning. Now finish up so we're not late for the Halloween parade. The school gymnasium was festively decorated with paper pumpkins, cardboard skeletons, and strings of miniature orange lights. Parents and grandparents filled the folding chairs arranged before a small stage, where each class would present a Brief Halloween-themed performance before the costume parade through the halls. Eleanor sat alone in the second row, Melissa having texted that she was running late but would try to make it for at least part of the event. As the principal welcomed the assembled families and explained the program, Eleanor found herself studying. The other grandparents in the audience, men and women her age or older, some accompanied by their adult children, others sitting independently as she was. How many of them lived with their children's families? How many maintained their own homes? Their own identity separate from their grandparental role? She had never considered these questions before, had accepted her dependent status as the natural consequence of widowhood and financial necessity. Now she wondered how many other options she might have explored had she not been so broken by grief when Thomas died. He children's Halloween performance was charming in its imperfection, forgotten lines hastily whispered by teachers, homemade costumes slightly askew, the unmistakable energy of elementary students barely containing their excitement. Eleanor watched with misty eyes as Emma delivered her lines flawlessly, her ghost sailor costume drawing appreciative comments from nearby parents. Jack, in his authentic lobsterman gear, performed with enthusiasm if not precision, his voice carrying to the back of the gymnasium when he announced that the terrifying crustacean creatures of the deep were coming to get everyone. Eleanor applauded until her hands hurt, pride swelling in her chest. These remarkable children had brought such joy to her life, had kept her connected to wonder and possibility during the difficult years following Thomas's death. The thought of seeing them less frequently created a physical ache in her chest, but she reminded herself that quality of connection mattered more than proximity. She would be a better grandmother as a whole, fulfilled person than as a resentful dependent in their home. Melissa slipped into the seat beside Eleanor just as the fifth grade began their performance. "Made it," she whispered, slightly out of breath. "Traffic was horrible. Did I miss the twins?" "They were wonderful," Eleanor assured her. "I recorded their parts on my phone to show you later." As they watched the remainder of the program together, Eleanor found herself studying her daughter's profile, the determined set of her jaw so like Thomas's, the tiny worry lines forming between her brows, the way she leaned forward slightly when something captured her attention. Melissa was a remarkable woman, driven, intelligent, loving in her somewhat distracted way. Eleanor felt a surge of pride in the adult her daughter had become, even as she recognized the growing distance between them. After the performances concluded, parents and grandparents followed the costumed children on their parade through the school hallways, where they collected treats from each classroom. Eleanor walked beside Melissa, both of them snapping photos as Jack and Emma proudly led their class, occasionally turning to wave at their family. "They're growing up so fast," Melissa observed, a note of wistfulness in her voice. "Sometimes I feel like I'm missing it all, buried in work and deadlines." The comment created an opening Eleanor hadn't expected. "That's part of why I've been their primary caregiver," she said carefully. "To ensure they have a family presence during these important years. But they need that from their parents too, not just their grandmother." Melissa sighed, running a hand through her hair in a gesture of frustration. "I know. Richard and I have talked about cutting back our hours, being more present. It's just, the Rockport project is make or break for his career, and my promotion review is coming up in December. Once we get through this period." It was a familiar refrain, the promise of more family time after the next big project, the next career milestone. Eleanor had heard variations of it throughout Melissa's adulthood, had watched her daughter perpetually defer personal fulfillment for professional achievement. She wondered now if her own presence in the household had enabled this pattern, making it too easy for Melissa and Richard to prioritize careers over parenting because Grandma was always there to fill the gap. Perhaps her departure would create space for necessary change, would force a recalibration of family dynamics and priorities. The thought provided additional reassurance that her decision, though difficult, was right for everyone involved. "Life is always happening now," Eleanor said gently, watching as Emma accepted a candy from a kindergarten teacher with perfect politeness. "Not after the next project or promotion. Now." Melissa glanced at her, surprise evident in her expression. Eleanor rarely offered such direct commentary on her daughter's life choices. "That sounds like something Dad would say," she observed after a moment. "He was a wise man," Eleanor replied with a small smile. "Though I didn't always appreciate that wisdom when he was sharing it." The Halloween parade concluded with cider and pumpkin cookies in the cafeteria, the children vibrating with sugar-fueled excitement. Eleanor savored these final moments of ordinary school grandmother life, helping Emma rearrange her sailor cap that had slipped askew, wiping chocolate from Jack's chin, accepting compliments from other parents on the twins' creative costumes. "We should get ice cream to celebrate how awesome we were," Jack suggested as they prepared to leave, his expression hopeful beneath the lobsterman's cap. "It's 50 degrees outside," Melissa pointed out with a laugh. Not exactly ice cream. Weather. There's no wrong weather for ice cream, Emma countered seriously. Grandma always says that. Right, Grandma? The simple reference to one of her oft-repeated phrases, a trivial family saying but one the children had internalized, brought unexpected emotion to Eleanor's throat. These small threads of connection, these shared references and inside jokes, were the fabric of family life. Would new ones continue to develop once she lived 2 hours away? Your grandmother is very wise about ice cream, Melissa conceded with a smile. But I was thinking we might do something special for dinner instead. Maybe order from that Thai place you both like? The suggestion was met with enthusiastic approval, and soon they were heading home, the twins recounting every moment of their performance from the back seat while Melissa and Eleanor exchanged amused glances from the front. It was a perfect, ordinary family afternoon, the kind Eleanor had experienced hundreds of times over the past 5 years, but which now carried the poignancy of imminent change. Back at the house, while Melissa called in their dinner order and the twins changed out of their costumes, Eleanor took a moment alone in her room, gathering her resolve for the conversation ahead. The 3 sealed letters sat in her nightstand drawer, ready to be left behind tomorrow. Her suitcase was packed and hidden in her closet, the boxes of books and mementos discreetly stacked where they wouldn't draw attention. All that remained was to tell her family that tomorrow she would be leaving, not for a visit or a vacation, but to start a new, independent life in Bar Harbor. The prospect sent her heart racing with anxiety, but beneath the nervousness lay a bedrock of certainty. This was the right decision, made for the right reasons, timed in the way that would be least disruptive for the children. She would wait until after dinner, she decided. Let them enjoy the Thai food and the excited post-Halloween conversation. Let the natural rhythm of the evening unfold before introducing the significant change. There would be tears, certainly, her own as well as the twins'. There would be questions and perhaps some anger from Melissa, who might feel blindsided despite their earlier conversation. But there would also be truth, dignity, and ultimately, Eleanor hoped, understanding. Dinner arrived in a flurry of fragrant containers, the dining table quickly covered with pad thai, green curry, spring rolls, and all the twins' favorites. The conversation flowed easily, centered on the Halloween celebration and plans for the actual holiday the following week. Eleanor participated warmly but found herself simultaneously observing the scene as if from a slight distance, memorizing details she would soon be missing, the way Jack always saved his favorite part of any dish for last, how Emma arranged her food in meticulous sections that couldn't touch, the precise sound of their laughter mingling across the table. Mom? Did you hear me? Melissa's question broke through Eleanor's reverie. I'm sorry, dear. I was wool gathering. What did you say? I asked if you'd mind if the twins stay overnight at Aidan Turner's house next Friday. His mom is hosting a Halloween sleepover for some of the kids in their class. I'd pick them up Saturday morning on my way back from my meeting in Augusta. The question highlighted how Eleanor's role in the family was taken for granted, her availability assumed, her agreement expected. Once, she would have automatically said yes, accommodating her daughter's schedule without question. Now, knowing she would be living in Bar Harbor by then, she faced a different kind of response. Actually, I wanted to talk to all of you about something, she said, setting down her fork and meeting Melissa's gaze directly. Something important. The seriousness in her tone drew everyone's attention. Even the twins stopped eating, sensing a shift in the atmosphere around the table. I've made a decision that will affect our family, Eleanor continued, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. I've decided to move back to Bar Harbor. I've rented an apartment above Blackwood's Books and will be relocating there, tomorrow. The silence that followed her announcement was absolute. Melissa's expression cycled through shock, confusion, and the beginnings of hurt. The twins exchanged glances, their young faces reflecting uncertainty about how to respond to this unexpected news. Tomorrow? Melissa finally managed, her voice strained. Mom, when we talked about this, I thought it was a plan for the future. Not tomorrow. I know, Eleanor acknowledged, regret coloring her tone. And I apologize for not being completely forthcoming about my timeline. But the apartment became available immediately, and I've made all the necessary arrangements. But why, Grandma? Emma's question cut straight to the heart of the matter, her voice small and confused. Don't you want to live with us anymore? Eleanor turned to her granddaughter, choosing her words with care. I love living with you. And Jack. Being your grandmother has been the greatest joy of these past 5 years. But I need to have my own home again, my own life. It doesn't mean I love you any less or that I won't see you regularly. It just means I need to be Eleanor Sullivan again, not just Grandma, all the time. Is it because of something we did? Jack asked, his lower lip trembling slightly. Absolutely not, Eleanor assured him firmly. You and Emma have been perfect grandchildren. This decision isn't about anything you did or didn't do. It's about what I need at this stage of my life. Melissa had been unusually quiet, processing this unexpected development. Now she spoke, her voice carefully controlled. The movers are coming tomorrow? You've already arranged everything? Eleanor nodded, unable to deny the evidence of how thoroughly she had planned this departure without her daughter's knowledge. Yes. They'll arrive at 9 to collect my belongings. It's not much, primarily clothing, books, and personal items. All the furniture stays, of course. I see. The two simple words carried a weight of hurt and disappointment. And you're just telling us now, the night before you leave. After 5 years of living together as a family. The criticism was fair, Eleanor acknowledged silently. She had chosen this approach deliberately, wanting to present her decision as an accomplished fact rather than a negotiable plan, but in doing so, she had denied her family the opportunity to process the change gradually. I believed this would be easier, she said, not defensively but with honest reflection. A clean break rather than weeks of discussion and potential conflict. But perhaps that was a mistake, and if so, I apologize. Jack, always quick to seek resolutions to family tension, spoke up. But we'll still see you, right, Grandma? We can visit you in Bar Harbor? Of course, Eleanor assured him, grateful for his pragmatic approach. I'm hoping you'll come for overnight visits once I'm settled. My apartment has a pull-out sofa bed in the living room that will be perfect for you and Emma. And I'll come to Portland regularly for your school events and special occasions. How will you support yourself? Melissa asked, the practical question carrying an undertone of continued hurt. Bar Harbor isn't cheap, Mom. Eleanor had anticipated this concern. I've sold your father's maritime collection, she explained, repeating what she had shared in their earlier conversation but adding details she had previously withheld. The proceeds will support me comfortably for several years. Additionally, I plan to work part-time once I'm settled, perhaps at the library or one of the museums. I've already had some preliminary conversations about possibilities. The thoroughness of her planning seemed to finally convince Melissa that this wasn't an impulsive decision but a carefully considered choice. Her expression softened slightly, though concern remained evident in her eyes. This is really happening, isn't it? You've made up your mind completely. Yes, Eleanor confirmed gently. I have. A heavy silence fell over the table, each person processing the significant change in their own way. Eleanor resisted the urge to fill the quiet with reassurances or explanations, allowing her family the space to absorb and respond authentically. It was Emma who broke the silence, her young face serious as she considered her grandmother. Is this because of what Dad said about you eating but not paying? I heard him say that. It was mean. The directness of the question startled Eleanor. She hadn't realized the children had overheard Richard's cutting remark, hadn't intended to place blame or create division within the family. Yet she wouldn't lie to her granddaughter, especially about something the child had witnessed herself. That comment was difficult to hear, Eleanor acknowledged carefully. But my decision isn't based on any single incident. It's about recognizing that at 68 years old, I need and deserve independence and dignity. I need to live where my contributions are valued, where I'm seen as a whole person rather than just in terms of the services I provide. Melissa looked stricken. Mom, we value you. You know that, don't you? You're not just a housekeeper or nanny to us. You're family. I know you love me, Eleanor assured her daughter. But love without respect isn't enough. And over time, I felt increasingly diminished in this household. Not by you or the children, she added quickly, but by the overall dynamic. She had deliberately avoided mentioning Richard directly, not wanting to create conflict between husband and wife. But Melissa wasn't naive, and Emma's reference to her father's comment had made the unspoken clear. Richard, Melissa said flatly. This is about how Richard treats you. Eleanor sighed, wishing she could have avoided this particular aspect of the conversation, especially with the twins present. Melissa, every household has its own complex dynamics. Richard and I have different perspectives on many things, including the value of non-financial contributions to a family. Rather than creating ongoing tension by remaining in a situation where those differences cause friction, I'm choosing to establish my own space where I can live according to my own values. It was as diplomatic as she could be while still acknowledging the truth. Richard's attitude toward her had been a significant factor in her decision, not the only factor, but certainly a catalyst that had forced her to recognize how her dignity and self-worth had eroded during her years of dependency. Melissa's expression hardened, anger beginning to replace hurt. He's been disrespectful to you. And I didn't notice, or worse, I noticed and didn't address it properly. Either way, I failed you, Mom. You didn't fail me, Eleanor objected firmly. You welcomed me into your home when I had nowhere else to go. You made space for me in your family's life. That was a tremendous gift, one I'll always be grateful for. But 5 years is a long time to be a guest in someone else's home, regardless of how welcomed I've been. The twins had been watching this exchange with wide eyes, absorbing the adult complexities playing out before them. Now Jack spoke up. His voice small but determined. I don't want you to go, Grandma. But I want you to be happy. Are you going to be happier in Bar Harbor? The simple question, delivered with a child's directness, brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. I believe I will be, Jack. Not because I'll be away from you, that part will be very hard, but because I'll be standing on my own 2 feet again, making my own decisions, living my own life. There's a special kind of happiness that comes from independence, from knowing you can take care of yourself. Jack considered this seriously, then nodded. Like when you let me ride my bike to the corner store by myself for the first time. I was scared but really proud too. Exactly like that, Eleanor agreed, touched by his insightful comparison. Sometimes the things that scare us a little are the most important to do. Emma, not to be outdone by her twin in maturity, added her own perspective. We'll miss you a lot, Grandma. But we can talk on the phone every day, right? And do video calls? Absolutely, Eleanor promised. Technology makes it easy to stay connected even when we're not in the same house. And Bar Harbor isn't so far away, just a 2-hour drive. We'll see each other regularly, I promise. As the initial shock of her announcement began to fade, the conversation shifted to practical questions. Where exactly was her apartment located? What would her phone number be? When could they come visit? Eleanor answered each query patiently, grateful for the twins' resilience and their ability to adapt to change with relative ease. Melissa remained more reserved, her emotions clearly mixed as she processed what her mother's departure would mean for the family's daily life. The practical implications were significant. Childcare arrangements would need to be adjusted, household responsibilities redistributed, new routines established. But beyond these logistical concerns, Eleanor sensed her daughter grappling with more profound questions. Had she failed to notice her mother's unhappiness? Had she allowed Richard's attitude to go unchallenged? What did this sudden departure reveal about their family dynamics? I'd like to help you move, Melissa said finally, as the conversation began to wind down. I could drive up with you tomorrow, help you get settled in the new apartment. The offer surprised Eleanor, who had expected continued hurt or even anger, not this gesture of support. That's very kind, but I've already arranged everything. The moving company will handle transporting my belongings, and Kathleen has prepared the apartment for my arrival. Still, Melissa persisted, I'd like to be part of this transition. To see where you'll be living, to help you start this new chapter. Understanding dawned. This wasn't just about practical assistance, it was about Melissa needing closure, needing to participate in this significant change rather than simply having it happen to her. Eleanor felt a rush of affection for her daughter, whose response, once the initial shock had passed, was to offer support rather than resistance. I'd welcome your company, she said sincerely. Perhaps you could bring the twins? Make it a family day? We could have lunch at the Wharf restaurant after we get my things settled in the apartment. The suggestion bridged the emotional gap that had opened between them, offering a way forward that acknowledged the change while preserving their connection. Melissa's expression softened with visible relief. I'd like that. We'd all like that, wouldn't we? She asked, glancing at the twins, who nodded enthusiastically. Can we bring our Halloween candy to eat on the drive? Jack negotiated, ever practical about the important things in life. A reasonable amount, Melissa agreed with a small laugh, the tension in the room noticeably dissipating. We don't want anyone getting carsick on those winding coastal roads. As the conversation shifted to logistics for the following day, Eleanor felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. She had anticipated resistance, tears, perhaps even anger, and while there had been hurt feelings and difficult questions, her family was already beginning to accept her decision with grace and understanding. The twins, with their characteristic resilience, were focusing on the adventure of helping Grandma moved to a new home. Melissa, despite her initial shock and hurt, was finding ways to support her mother's choice rather than attempting to change her mind. Only Richard remained unaware of the imminent change, still in Boston attempting to salvage his investment deal. Eleanor had wrestled with whether to call him directly but had ultimately decided the letter she had written expressed her thoughts more clearly than a potentially heated phone conversation would allow. Melissa would inform him once Eleanor had departed, and he could read the letter when he returned home Sunday evening. After dinner, as the family transitioned to their usual evening routines, homework for the twins, work emails for Melissa, Eleanor found herself drawn to the backyard. The October night was clear and cold, stars pricking the darkness above the Portland skyline. She wrapped her cardigan more tightly around herself and sat on the wooden bench Thomas had built for Melissa's 12th birthday, a piece of furniture that had followed their daughter from home to home over the decades. The garden was dormant. Now, the raised beds she had lovingly tended cleared for winter, the perennials cut back, the last of the fall harvest gathered weeks ago. Come spring, someone else would decide what to plant in these beds. Perhaps Melissa would discover an interest in gardening, or Richard would hire a landscape service, or the space would simply go fallow, reclaimed by weeds and wild things. The thought brought no sadness, only a peaceful acceptance that life moved forward, that care given freely would yield fruit even when the caregiver was no longer present. She had nurtured this garden for 5 years, had taught the twins about planting seeds and tending growth, had provided their family with fresh vegetables and herbs throughout each growing season. That knowledge and appreciation would remain. With them, a legacy more lasting than the physical space itself. A soft sound behind her announced Melissa's approach. Her daughter settled beside her on the bench, silent for several moments as they both gazed at the star-scattered sky. I used to find you and Dad sitting exactly like this in the backyard of the Portland house, Melissa observed finally. Just quietly looking at the stars together. I thought it was boring when I was a teenager. Why would anyone just sit and look at the sky? Now I understand better. Eleanor smiled, touched by the memory. Your father believed stargazing provided perspective. Human problems seem smaller when you're contemplating the vastness of the universe. I wish he was here, Melissa said softly. He would know exactly what to say about all this, some perfect Thomas Sullivan wisdom that would make everything clear. He would say that love doesn't diminish with distance, Eleanor replied with certainty. He would say that every person deserves dignity and independence, especially in their later years. And he would be proud of you for supporting my decision, even though it's difficult. Melissa was quiet for a moment, absorbing these words. I'm sorry I didn't notice how unhappy you've been, Mom. I've been so wrapped up in work and the kids. And all the daily chaos. I just assumed you were content with the arrangement we had. I wasn't unhappy, Eleanor corrected gently. I cherished every moment with you and the twins. But there's a difference between contentment and fulfillment. Between being appreciated for what you do and being respected for who you are. I need to reclaim that sense of wholeness, of being a complete person rather than just a supportive role in someone else's story. Melissa nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her expression. Like when I took that leave of absence after the twins were born. Everyone kept asking when I was going back to work, as if being a mother wasn't enough, wasn't a complete identity. I needed both, my career and my family, to feel whole. Exactly, Eleanor agreed, pleased by her daughter's insight. And at this stage of my life, I need both my role as your mother and the twins' grandmother and my identity as Eleanor Sullivan, a woman with her own home, her own interests, her own place in a community. I get it, Melissa said, and for the first time, Eleanor believed she truly did. I'm going to miss you terribly, but I understand why you need to do this. And I'll make sure the twins understand too, beyond just the excitement of visiting you in Bar Harbor. They sat together in companionable silence for several minutes, the night air growing colder around them, the distant sound of traffic on the main road a reminder of the city continuing its rhythms beyond their quiet moment. There's one more thing, Melissa said eventually, her voice hesitant. About Dad's collection. I shouldn't have reacted the way I did when you mentioned selling it. Those pieces were yours to do with as you wished. I apologize for suggesting otherwise. The apology touched Eleanor deeply. Thank you for that. It wasn't an easy decision, those items meant a great deal to both of us. But I think your father would approve of how they're being used now. To fund your independence? Absolutely, Melissa agreed with a small smile. Dad always said you were the strongest person he knew, even when you didn't see it yourself. He'd be cheering you on right now. The thought brought tears to Eleanor's eyes, not of sadness but of profound gratitude for the man who had loved her so completely, who had always encouraged her to recognize her own strength and worth. He believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself, she said softly. After he died, I lost sight of that for a while. But I'm finding it again. As they rose to go inside, the cold finally driving them from their contemplation of the night sky, Melissa impulsively embraced her mother. I love you, Mom. And I'm proud of you for making this choice, even though I wish circumstances hadn't made it necessary. Eleanor returned the hug, holding her daughter close for a moment that seemed to contain all the complexity of their relationship, the deep love, the occasional misunderstandings, the shared history, the evolving future. I love you too, sweetheart. Always and completely, no matter where I live. Later that night, as Eleanor made final preparations for the following day's move, she found herself filled with a profound sense of peace. The conversation with her family had gone better than she had dared hope. There had been hurt feelings and difficult questions, certainly, but also understanding, support, and ultimately acceptance. The twins, with their remarkable resilience, were already looking forward to visiting her in Bar Harbor. Melissa, after her initial shock, had found her way to genuine support of her mother's decision. Only Richard remained an unknown factor in the equation. Would he be angry? Relieved? Perhaps both? Eleanor found she no longer particularly cared about his reaction. She had written her letter with dignity and clarity, expressing her perspective without accusation or bitterness. How he received that message was beyond her control and, increasingly, beyond her concern. As she drifted toward sleep on her final night in her daughter's home, Eleanor's thoughts turned to the apartment above Blackwood's Books, its bay window overlooking Cedar Street, its built-in bookshelves waiting to be filled, its promise of dignity and independence. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not a retreat, but an advance toward the life she deserved, one where her value wasn't measured by the services she provided but by the simple, profound fact of her existence as a woman of wisdom, experience, and enduring strength. Richard's cruel words, "You eat our food, but you never pay," had wounded her deeply. But they had also awakened her from a kind of passive acceptance, challenging her to recognize her own worth and to demand the respect she deserved. In a strange way, she owed him a debt of gratitude for that unintended gift, the catalyst that had propelled her toward reclaiming her dignity, her independence, and ultimately, her sense of self. Tomorrow would bring a new chapter in her life story. At 68, Eleanor Sullivan was starting over, proving that it was never too late to choose self-respect over comfortable dependency, to prioritize dignity over convenience, to reclaim one's identity after years of allowing it to be diminished by others' perceptions and expectations. As sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor's last conscious thought was of gratitude, for the 5 years with her grandchildren, for her daughter's ultimate understanding, for the financial means to make this change, and most of all, for the inner strength that had allowed her to recognize when staying would cost more than leaving. "You eat but don't pay," Richard had said, reducing her to a financial calculation. Tomorrow she would walk away from that reductive assessment, reclaiming her worth not in dollars and cents but in the currency of dignity, independence, and self-determination. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of crisp autumn day that seemed designed for new beginnings. Eleanor woke before her alarm, excitement and anticipation overriding her usual morning sluggishness. Today she would leave behind 5 years of increasing dependency and diminished self-worth. Today she would reclaim her identity as Eleanor Sullivan, not just someone's mother or grandmother, but a woman in her own right, making her own choices, living on her own terms. The house was still quiet as she rose and dressed, selecting comfortable clothes for the drive to Bar Harbor. She could hear the twins beginning to stir in their rooms, their weekend morning whispers and giggles a familiar soundtrack she would soon be missing. The thought brought a pang of sadness, quickly balanced by the knowledge that their relationship would continue, would perhaps even grow stronger without the daily friction that had begun to characterize her interactions with Richard. By the time she emerged from her room, Melissa and the twins were in the kitchen, preparing a special breakfast. The scent of cinnamon and vanilla filled the air, French toast, Eleanor realized with a rush of emotion. They were making her favorite breakfast as a send-off gesture. Surprise, the twins chorused when she appeared in the doorway. "We're making your breakfast today, Grandma. Since you've made approximately 1 million meals for us over the past 5 years, Melissa added. With a warm smile. "We thought we'd return the favor on your last morning here." The simple acknowledgement of her daily labor, the countless meals she had prepared, the endless domestic tasks she had performed, touched Eleanor deeply. This recognition of her contributions, freely given without calculation or expectation of return, was exactly what had been missing from her relationship with Richard. "Thank you," she said, emotion making her voice husky. "This is a lovely surprise." They ate together at the kitchen table, the conversation flowing easily between reminiscence about the past 5 years and plans for Eleanor's new life in Bar Harbor. The twins were full of questions about her apartment, eager to help arrange her belongings when they arrived later that day. Melissa shared ideas for making the small space functional and comfortable, offering to help search for specialized furniture designed for compact living. "We could get you one of those beds that folds up into the wall," Jack suggested enthusiastically. "Like in spy movies when they need to hide quickly." "I think Grandma probably prefers a regular bed," Melissa replied with a laugh. "But that's good thinking about space-saving options." The moving company arrived promptly at 9, 2 efficient young men who treated Eleanor with professional courtesy and respect. "Where would you like us to start, Miss Sullivan?" the older one asked, clipboard in hand as he surveyed her modest collection of boxes. The simple act of being addressed by her own name, of having her preferences sought and respected, reinforced the rightness of her decision. This was how interactions should feel, like exchanges between equals rather than transactions where one party's worth was constantly being evaluated and found wanting. Within an hour, the movers had loaded Eleanor's possessions into their truck and departed for Bar Harbor, scheduled to meet her at the apartment at noon. The family would follow in Melissa's SUV, taking a more leisurely pace along the coastal route, stopping for lunch before helping Eleanor settle into her new home. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor took one final walk through the room that had been hers for 5 years. The space looked surprisingly bare with her personal touches removed, the photographs of Thomas, the small watercolor paintings she had collected over the years, the handcrafted quilt that had adorned her bed. Without these items marking it as hers, it reverted to what it had always been in Richard's eyes, a guest room, temporarily occupied but never truly belonging to her. On the nightstand, she placed the 3 sealed letters she had written, one for Melissa, one for the twins, and one for Richard. Though they had spoken openly the previous evening, she wanted her family to have her written thoughts as well, words they could return to as they adjusted to her absence from their daily lives. "Ready, Mom?" Melissa appeared in the doorway, car keys in hand, the twins waiting impatiently behind her. "We should get going if we want to reach Bar Harbor by noon." Eleanor took one last look around the room, a space that had sheltered her during the difficult years following Thomas's death but had never truly felt like home. "Yes," she said with quiet certainty. "I'm ready." The drive to Bar Harbor passed pleasantly, the coastal scenery spectacular as always, the conversation flowing easily among the 4 of them. The twins took turns reading aloud from a guidebook about Mount Desert Island, sharing facts about the area's history and natural features with endearing enthusiasm. Melissa drove competently, occasionally asking Eleanor questions about her plans for the coming weeks, when she might begin looking for part-time work, what community activities she hoped to join, how she would furnish the apartment. By the time they reached the outskirts of Bar Harbor, Eleanor felt a growing sense of homecoming. The familiar landmarks, the granite face of Cadillac Mountain rising in the distance, the causeway spanning the Narrows to Mount Desert Island, the small beaches and rocky coves visible through breaks in the pine forest, all welcomed her with the comfort of long association. "It's beautiful here," Melissa observed as they drove through the village toward Cedar Street. "I forgot how charming Bar Harbor is in the off-season, without all the summer tourists. This is when it truly belongs to the year-round residents." Eleanor agreed. "When we can reclaim our town from the cruise ships and tour buses." The casual "we" slipped out naturally, already identifying herself as a Bar Harbor resident rather than a visitor. The twins noticed, exchanging pleased glances. In the back seat. "You already sound like you live here again, Grandma," Emma observed. "I suppose I do," Eleanor acknowledged with a smile. "Some places just feel like home, no matter how long you've been away." Blackwood's Books came into view as they turned onto Cedar Street, its cheerful red door and large display windows immediately recognizable. Kathleen stood on the sidewalk outside, waving as their car approached. Beside her waited a tall, distinguished-looking man with salt and pepper hair whom Eleanor recognized with surprise as Daniel Marsden, the antique dealer who had purchased Thomas's collection. "Looks like you have a welcoming committee," Melissa observed as she parked the car. "So it seems," Eleanor agreed, pleasantly surprised by Marsden's presence. She had formed a positive impression of him during their brief business interaction, appreciating his respect for Thomas's collection and his fair approach to their transaction. But she hadn't expected him to take a personal interest in her relocation to Bar Harbor. As they exited the car, Kathleen rushed forward to embrace Eleanor warmly. "Welcome home," she said, her voice carrying genuine emotion. "The apartment is all ready for you, fresh linens on the bed, basic groceries in the refrigerator, flowers on the table." "You've thought of everything," Eleanor said gratefully, introducing her friend to Melissa and the twins. Daniel Marsden stepped forward. Next, extending his hand with a warm smile. "Miss Sullivan, welcome back to the island. I hope your journey was pleasant?" "Very much so," Eleanor confirmed, curious about his presence. "This is my daughter, Melissa, and my grandchildren, Jack and Emma." "Melissa, this is Mr. Marsden, the antique dealer who purchased your father's collection. A pleasure to meet you." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.